Elizabeth and Joseph from Old Sins Publishing, writers and editors and jack of all trades. And we're continuing our topic of how DMing and writing books are basically one and the same thing, with today's topic of how do you prep to write your very first campaign or your very first novel. I feel a little more close to this topic just because I am still on my first novel. So for me, it feels very real, like we were just doing this a while ago. So I have a lot of thoughts on this one.
You actually finished your first novel and we published it. It's called Colorblind, and you should buy it if you're watching this.
Yeah, so I'm really close, but I haven't published anything since then. So for me, it's still very close to when I was starting my first novel process. Yeah, Colorblind took a really long time to get out the gate, and I wrote it for 7 years, but I wouldn't even say that I was truly writing it. I was truly researching it for 6 of those 7 years, getting all the bits and bobs together. Same thing when I did my very first, again, I've only done one campaign that I've written. So same thing, right off that, still trying to figure out all this stuff, where I go from here. For me, I couldn't do enough research, and by research, I mean writing character studies. For me, the biggest way that I figured out what I wanted to do with my story wasn't, I looked at stuff, it was like, write down all your plot points on little index cards and move them around, or write the beginning and the end and figure out how to get there. For me, I kind of started in the middle with who I wanted my characters to be, and then expanded out from there. The plot kind of came afterwards.
Well, characters are the primary focus of most good stories. So that's not a bad idea. The story should derive from the characters and their needs and wants, and the mistakes they make, and the victories and failures they have. So that's really a good way to do it. And in D&D, you can do the same thing. Just yesterday, I had a bunch of new players in a pre-existing world, and I didn't know where to start that world. So I asked each player to introduce themselves, and the character, obviously, not the player. And given all of their introductions, I was able to cobble together a plot which they could find interesting, which utilized every single one of those characters' backgrounds, or at least most of them. So they could have an entrance into the campaign world which they felt was appropriate. This is possible only if you really know your campaign world. And I know that after 7 years of work, well, I saw 2 years of it, right?
Yeah.
So
much.
After about 2 years of work, after about 5 years of work, you knew where you were in your campaign, so to speak, your novel.
When I started, it was modern day. Like, I had no idea where I was going with this. So it took 5 years to get to this time stream that I
Was
created.
one of them Ella and the other one Bedward?
No, gosh. Don't get me wrong. I actually did read all the Twilight books.
I thought you wouldn't have done that.
I'm kinder to them now than I was back then. There was a point that I earnestly loved them, then a point that I thought they were hysterical, and now a point where I realized we really hated on them just for providing teenage girls with fantasy, and how many times we let little boys have fantasies and never comment on that. I have complicated feels on Twilight.
I felt that way because the protagonist was a cipher and poorly written out. She was very much a placeholder character for whoever the reader was.
Yeah, and it's that wish fulfillment thing. It's your Luke Skywalker. It's your Mary Sue.
He's a punk.
Hurt yourself here.
So, Luke Skywalker's a whiny punk.
Very much so.
Anyways, so...
Anyway, we're off topic. The same thing happened with my campaign. The campaign only happened at all because I had written a short story previous detailing a character in it and what happened to them. And after doing that, I felt comfortable enough in the world to say, okay, I can now feel comfortable bringing this to a bunch of people who want to, like, mess around in the world and poke around. If it had been a novel, I don't even know how long it would have gone on. We would have gone all over the world. But as it was a 3-episode arc. And that was as much as I can handle my first time out.
And that actually is something that's a key to both novel writing and D&D campaigns is you need to be comfortable in it before you start introducing other people to it. And there's all sorts of ways to do that. Writing character studies is a very good way. But basically, you need to know the world in and out, or at least have a way to get in and out of the world where you have, okay, I know this, so I need to research something else. For example, I have a ton of books over here. Say you want to know about the criminal justice system in your world, well, pick up a criminology textbook, you know.
I love that you brought props today.
Of course I brought props. We're in my office, and we're in yours, although that is the cleanest I've ever seen your office. But anyway.
Gotta keep the books happy.
That's right. So you can buy textbooks like this at most used bookstores, or if you have a campus nearby, you can buy the much older versions, you know, dating back 4 years even, from most of your college bookstores. And they will be still relevant to what you need to know. Okay? And so if you're thinking, hey, I need to throw in a cop character, how do cops behave? Obviously, it's a fantasy world or science fictional world, so they're not going to behave like American police. That's a mistake a lot of people make when writing these worlds, is they model them after their own cultures, mores, and so on. But you can have an idea as to the way someone would approach these things. You know, the methodologies they use would be similar in attitude, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think the same thing. It's kind of like they always have the old adage, write what you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what you know can come from both books and experience. I think it works best when you have an experience and then you want to learn more about it, so you expand through research and knowledge. Like, okay, now let me know even more about this. Then if you love the forest, you love being in the forest, that's good. That means that you'll know how to feel when you're there. But if you wanted some research about how certain trees and animals behave in the ecosystems and the environment, you do the research, it'll make it. No fact is unnecessary. You could read 60 articles and only use one fact that you learned, but everything else that you learn accumulates and becomes part of your overall knowledge and gives you greater insight into the world. Even if you never use that particular thing, it feeds into something else.
That's very true. And write what you know, I think, really applies primarily to characters, because when you're writing something fantastic in general, and this could simply be a cozy mystery that takes place in a small town, but if you're writing something fantastic, you can't know that stuff, you know. If you do only write what you know, you're going to see a lot of books that deal with exactly the same sort of breakups and get together in the same sort of urban settings, and because that's just the standard. Everybody's going to have some sort of horrible experience in college, and they're going to write about this, or in high school, and they're going to write about this, and it's going to be completely redundant. And that's why lit crit books are always about some professor having an affair with a grad student with a wife who he feels doesn't understand him. It's because that's what they know. So, what? It's not true?
That's not perfect. I'm thinking of every pop song ever from every under 20-something who deals with heartbreak like they're the first person to ever experience it.
Well, for them, it's a crucial time, and for them, it's a critical event. But the thing is, you need to translate that into something other than the situation. You know, have someone who's not a mirror of yourself experience this heartbreak, you know. I mean, I love Taylor Swift, but for a long time there, that's all she wrote. Of course, if you look at it, that's pretty much all male pop stars and rock stars write about, too. That and just sex. And
it's amazing how much of them are just sex.
Well, you know, it's what they know, you know.
Yeah.
So, I think that the best thing in that situation is to, when you're talking about write what you know, is the core of it needs to be what you know. but the externalities, heartbreak in a galactic empire is going to be the same as heartbreak in a small town, because heartbreak is part of the human condition. So, it's always going to be there. It's like war will always be with us. The nature of the war will change dramatically depending upon the era and the situation. And, like the U.S. has literally been at war for all but like 5 years of its history. But how it affects each generation is completely different depending upon the way the wars are and how integrated they are with the global world. So
exactly. I say you make sure you can walk around in the world. Pretend you're just an NPC. Walk around in your world. See if it makes sense. See if everything works out normal for you. And if not, figure out why.
Yeah. And here's my second demonstration. Get yourself a book of economics. Like just a textbook of economics. I recommend the Cartoon Guide to Economics, except book 2 goes into Keynesianism like it's God's gift to everything, and it's not. But you need to get a book of economics because so much of your characters' lives will be directly affected by wealth and property and just the way energy is exchanged. In your book Colorblind, for example, we're talking about this isn't much of a spoiler since it happens pretty early on, talking about a wealthy family that becomes down on its luck. So, and that's one of the primary motivators for everything they do, right?
Yeah, it's pretty much the inciting incident.
Right. And for your players in a D&D campaign, they're all loot hungry, and extremely greedy. So economics is really core. They need to get wealth, and preferably of the shiny type, and you need to make sure that they have access to it and they get it in a sensible way.
I learned that really hard in my first campaign. All they did was loot bodies and corpses and want to fight, and I'm like, I have a story. You could negotiate. No, fight. Okay, what's in the body?
Yes, and you look it up, and so you're never going to get a D&D people who, a D&D player who is not interested in what they can take away from the session, both, intellectually and, more importantly, materially. So, after all, we are all murder hobos in that world. So, but I mean, the thing affects your novels in exactly the same way. People need, they need something like money, even if they don't officially have money, like the Star Trek universe. There still is going to be a needed medium of exchange for goods and services, and that's money, and that affects the plot. I mean, even if you're dealing with a drawing room mystery where everybody is incredibly rich, wealth still will affect the plot.
Perhaps even more so, because now it's in the minutia.
Yes, exactly. And, if you think that these drawing room mysteries and cozies and so on aren't related to D&D, then you need to throw more mysteries at your players. People really like mysteries in their games. And
that can show up in dungeons, literal puzzles you have to figure out, lateral thinking puzzles, as well as the overarching narrative. The cool thing about D&D is that you're feeding them bits and drabs, and if they ask the right questions, they learn more and more about where you're going with this. I think all of the campaigns that I've played in and that I've been a part help DM, they're all really good because there are little mysteries inside of the bigger overall question of why are we here? Literally, why are we playing the game?
And that's very, very true about a novel which you're writing as well. There needs to be mystery to it. You are doling out things in dribs and drabs to the reader and to the protagonists and antagonists. So it's the same regardless, which is one of the themes of this. And right here, you can see where I kind of started to write something, but we're recording this on my computer, and the iSight camera built in automatically mirrors things for some reason, and you can't turn that feature off. So that's great.
That's unfortunate. For next video, then.
Anyways, now another thing I'd like to emphasize is look at your history of something relevant to what you're talking about, because I guarantee you people have done all of what you're talking about before. Okay?
There's only 14 stories in the entire world.
What? That number changes depending on who you talk to. I've heard 5. I've heard...
Wow.
Yeah, it really does. But the thing is, no matter what the setting is, there's something similar to it, and you can cobble it together with a little bit of thinking. You know, throw in, and say in one of my more recent books, we have basically a space station that is a trading center. So you can't read this because it's mirror-righted and it's kind of shiny. This is a history of Venice. So if you're looking at mercantile empires with places that were little tiny out-of-the-way cities, because Venice was never that big, and which end up controlling a large amount of area around them through the force of trade and construction. Venice is it, and that describes my space station kingdom pretty well.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because for some reason, even before you showed me that book, when I read your novel, I thought, this feels a lot like Venice. Not in any sort of look, but it operated in much the same way as I would expect of a small mercantile nation that controls a larger thing than what it actually is. It gives off that vibe.
Oh, well, that's good, because I hadn't read anything about Venice yet when I wrote it. This is more for the second novel in the series, but yeah. But I mean, I was keeping that in mind. I hadn't read anything. I had done other research, but this is how you build out your campaign world or your novel world is the same. You look at similar examples. Even though D&D is supposed to be medieval, a lot of it feels more like the High Renaissance. You know, you have much greater literacy, much greater mobility. You have towns where there are guilds, which is high medieval, early Renaissance. So you're going to be looking at some things from the early medieval era, like when you go to the small towns, or from the much later periods, hundreds of years later, when it comes to the cities and everything in between. So don't narrow yourself down to just one period. Same sort of thing is true if you are writing anything. How things existed in the deep past affect how things are right now in your novel or in real life. And that's one of the reasons why our company is called Old Sins, is because old sins cast long shadows is an old saying which came to us from monks, I believe. And it describes how even small incidents in the past can lead to major events in the present. And
that's why I like our alternate history anthologies, for that exact reason. You know, that you can do alternate history where it's just one incident, but one incident can have devastating different consequences. The world may not even look the same as it does now if only one thing was different. So it's important to not let yourself be limited by linear thought. You got to extrapolate.
Yeah, and that's very true, regardless of, even if you're writing a period drama, okay, you still have to be aware of, and in fact, actually more so, you need to be aware of the deep history, you know, that you're reflecting. When you deal with characters, their backgrounds will inform what is to come. Either the characters are player characters or they're characters you made up whole cloth. They're still going to be they're still going to be driven by what's in their past. So, and then of course I'm going to go on. You need to also know, if you want to build out something, things like folk tales, or I don't have them with me. I actually thought I had them. Because folk tales and mythologies just are amazingly good sources for how people think of themselves.
Not their relationship to the world. It's extremely telling that the Greeks think their gods are just as human as they are, just as two-timing, just as deceptive, just as violent. It's just the same way that Christianity sees its God, depending on which testament you're looking at, as a more benevolent and kind and above us, impossible of reach sort of God. And then even when you have your lower stuff, like every folk tale has a trickster god hiding out in it. And I always love reading about those guys most of all.
And the thing about folk tales and urban legends especially is they really are primarily about what's happening to the people who are telling them. People are scared about the guy with a hook in his hand in the back of the car because, well, there's a huge amount of analysis of it, but basically because they are afraid of the other. They are afraid of things which they have become too acclimatized to see problems. A lot of people argue it means that they're afraid of the technology, the vehicle itself, which they can hide. That sort of thing.
Yeah, there's when you look at different folk tales about ghosts and monsters, those are like our fears of the past, of the things that we have done that are coming back to haunt us. Whereas the folk tales about being stolen and taken up into skies, alien abduction is our fear of the future. Demons. Of all the things that we've done to people might then do to us.
Yeah. And this may not inform what your story is going to be about, but it should inform somewhat along the lines of what typical fears and hopes are for the characters in your society, because these folktales have a resonance with them. There's a folktale called John Henry Was a Steel Driving Man, which I don't know if it's still being taught, but it's about the paranoia of being replaced, being made irrelevant. And frankly, John Henry should have quit, and therefore he would have lived to have a productive job later on, as opposed to giving his life in a futile contest that, sure, he died and won, but he died. It's not like... And he was the best of the best. I mean, what does that say about everybody else? Everybody else who even tries to compete against the machine is going to die horribly. So,
Yeah, what are you trying to say there? What's the moral that you got going on?
But I mean, this is the stories that people tell themselves to make themselves, to express their feelings in a lot of ways. And I think that that's relevant to know these things when you go in to create a world. I mean,
Absolutely.
You don't have to make up your own John Henry. You just, have to know what that fear feels like.
Yeah. Pretend that you're going to go live in this place for 6 months, like you're planning a vacation or a forced annexation, or you're stalking someone online. Learn everything.
Yes.
Everything is important. Everything can be a weapon.
Right. And the more you know, the more you can build out logically. So your world starts to feel lived in. But that leads to an incredibly important point. Write down absolutely everything you find interesting. I mean,
you'll lose it otherwise. You'll lose it forever. I have documents, pages full of notes of random things that are some of them are at least 8 years old, and they've never done anything, but one day they may do something, and I'm going to feel like a butt if I didn't write it down somewhere.
Yeah, and it's when you come across this sort of thing and you like it, you write it down, and then when you use it, this is even more important, write down how you used it. Because the alternative is basically you end up with the problem that Star Trek had, where everybody had multiple different events that happened in their childhood that ended up becoming contradictory because, you know, they're over so many different years and so many... Are you gone there?
My phone's telling me, hey, you've been recording a long time. It likes to do that.
So, all right, well, I guess... But basically, you need to write it down, put it in a timeline where you can see it, put it in an area which is appropriate to it, so, you know, next time your party wanders off into these woods, they don't see a fairy castle where there once was a den of wolves. Unless, of course, the wolves are werewolves who made a killing in the stock market. So,
in other words, don't become George R. R. Martin.
Well, I didn't know he did that, but then I've never read him, so.
Oh, no, goodness, no. If he had put a fairy castle that turned into a werewolf castle, that would be pretty fabulous. No, as more so, don't make your world so ginormous that you forget where things are and then start to contradict yourself.
Exactly. That's seriously problematic. Piers Anthony, who is a writer whose work is very good for the first book in the series and then goes downhill from there, and probably most people haven't read because he was part of the movement that was a bit creepy sexually in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. So they're supposed to be children's books, but they're icky in a lot of ways.
Yeah, Piers Anthony, oh gosh, what was it? Something with ogres? That was sitting in my middle school library shelf. I read that when I was in the 6th grade, and I haven't been able to read a Piers Anthony book since. It was too early.
Yes. Regardless of all that, Piers Anthony did something really smart. He mapped out his world of Xanth based on his backyard. Okay? So he knew where everything was because he had a visual representation of it, where he could literally look out the window and see, okay, that's where that is relative to this. And that's a very smart thing to do.
I love that. I love that idea. Yeah, relating it to something in your life is the easiest way to make connections that way.
Yes. But this video has gone on for quite some time, and...
Maybe you can make it a two-parter then.
We'll see.
If you have ideas about DMing, if you are having similar problems with your first story, your first campaign, comment below what things and tools you've used to overcome these hurdles.
Yes, or if you want to yell at us, that's perfectly welcome.
It is the internet, after all.
That's right, and just don't be terribly creepy. So, also, both of us are married, so, you know, and not to each other.
An important fact to mention, yes. You don't have to worry about flirting with us. It's okay. We're taken.
That's right. But please, if you like our work, please subscribe to it. We don't ask that you like it because we're not insecure like that.
But talk to us. We do like talking.
Yes. Well, I've been Joseph Cadotte, and still am.
And I've been Elizabeth Pines / Kidder, depending on what you buy.
You can find her work under Elizabeth Kidder and mine under Joseph Cadotte. And we're Old Sims, and we've been talking about game mastering and writing.